So thank you everyone for joining me here today. So what are we talking about? So remote learning is not new. In fact, it's pretty advanced at this point. So why do we still have in-person instruction? Why do we do this? That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with a quick look, kind of like at a macro level, the history of remote learning, the roots and where we are. We're going to ask ourselves, why does remote learning or why does in-person learning still exist, given how expensive and difficult it can be? I'll propose 5 kind of key techniques to add value to the in-person instruction experience. And then we'll talk a little bit about my experience teaching in the shed in kind of the non-typical classroom environment and some things that I tried to deliver that value in person in that kind of intersection of space and in-person lecturing. And finally, I'm going to open the floor to ideas and thoughts and discussion to this group online and in person to how you may be able to use that space in your classes as well. All right. So remote learning is not new. In a sense, it's over 5,000 years old, right? Writing first emerges in 3400 BCE in Sumer on clay tablets. A few hundred years pass, and that skill, writing, and literacy has passed far enough that you have the transmission of information between people who have never met one another. It starts out as accounting records, legal edicts, deeds, but it very rapidly becomes poems, myths, religion, instructions, diagrams. Technology flows from person to person who have never met each other. So really, remote learning goes back that far. Now, from a structured standpoint, it goes back at least 300 years, probably well before that. But right here in this country, before it was the United States in 1728, Caleb Phillips began advertising shorthand correspondence courses in Boston. The idea that you could learn a skill set via postal service. Go back 165 years ago, and we see the first patent for recording of audio by de Martinville in France. All of a sudden, we have a remote learning tool for auditory learners, a new modality. People can hear and learn, not just read and learn. 135 years ago, we have the first video production. So now we have the ability to record. We can see things being done. You can watch somebody dissect a frog, work on a transmission. You can see, you can hear, you can read. Remote learning is already happening. It just accelerates from there. You have the introduction of the radio for transmission, 1897. You have the introduction of the television for remote transmission of video, 1927. And it goes on from there. 1969, it gets real interesting. ARPANET is invented. 1983, internet as we conceive it is invented. 1991, CERN introduces the first public website. Summer of 1993, picture this. It's a balmy 75-degree day in northern New York. At Clarkson University, a young Andrew Dimmock experiences his first web page in the Mosaic browser at a programming contest before he enters the 10th grade. That's how recent some of this is, right? 2003, Skype launches, introducing video, streaming video to the masses. 2005, YouTube launches. All of a sudden, anyone can learn in 10 minutes how to install a shallow well pump or, do their foundation, properly blend it. Keep going. You look at the pandemic of 2020. COVID-19 hits, and all of a sudden we can rapidly shift. Societies across the planet, across all spectrum of the academic sphere, from kindergarten to the college level, are able to change modalities and teach and keep some level of education going on. So remote learning works, right? It's been around, it works. Maybe not works perfectly, but there's value there. So why do we continue to teach in person? It's really expensive. There's clearly value, right? Space is expensive. Let's just look at the shed for a minute. This is an excerpt from a couple of years ago when the shed was just kind of getting off the ground. It was projected to be 100 million. The media is reporting now, as of last week, it's 120 million. Reality, by the time all those bills come due, probably it's a lot more than $120 million to build one building. If you look on the slides, that's from the RIT IRS 2018-990 form that nonprofits file. That line is the totality of the costs of employees, so salaries and benefits for RIT. The first one is 2017, the second one is 2018. Those were the ones I could rapidly find. $386 million. Extrapolate that out to 2013. They're spending at least $400 million a year on us, me, you, all of us. So clearly there is value there. Why are students paying $54,000 a year to support that infrastructure? There is value in doing this. As faculty members, it's really important for us to think carefully about how we deliver that value and not take that for granted, right? How do we make sure we understand what they're getting from that experience and how that is different than what they can get online? Because if we fail that, we're not doing justice to those investments. So here today, I am going to propose 5 techniques for adding value through in-person instruction. These are not intended to be an exhaustive list, a complete list. These are just some techniques that I think work. They are meant to work together. And before anyone in the room raises your hand and says, but wait, I'm looking at your list. We can do that by Zoom. Okay, I would say technically, yes. And then I would say practically, can you? So I've spent most of my career working for organizations spread around the country, going to in-person meetings, but spending a lot of time for over a decade doing remote meetings. And for 2 years during the pandemic, like all of us, doing exclusively remote meetings, exclusively teaching remotely. And I will tell you, it doesn't work. It sometimes works. You can do some of these things, but it doesn't work well and it doesn't work consistently. And if you disagree, I'm willing to have that discussion outside of this talk today, but let's just all pretend that we agree with that as a premise and we can have that outside of here. But the 5 things I'm going to talk about now are physical movement, kinesthetic learning, practical problem solving, verbalization and verbal interaction, and most importantly, the keystone to all of this is social contextualization. So humans, more than any other species, depend on each other for learning. Most species are born with significant genetic programming on how to survive and do basic tasks. We are not. We are extremely vulnerable when we are born. We are dependent on learning. We're very good at experiential learning. When we run into things, we solve problems, we learn on our own. But what we are really unique at is cultural learning. Transmission of knowledge from one individual to another individual, passing that knowledge on. That happens in a social context. We have evolved in a way that we learn very efficiently through that means. Many studies have shown in childhood development how important that socialization is to the learning brain. Then a lot of disorders are related to socialization issues when it comes to learning disorders, which we won't get into, that's beyond the scope here. But social interaction supports learning in an almost unique way to the human species. And interestingly, it's across domains. Language is an obvious place where you don't need to be a scientist that's read 1,000 studies to explain it. It's fairly obvious. Language is an interaction between people to transmit information, and language is naturally supported by socialization, granted. But it supports across all of the domains that we know of, from visual, spatial, categorization, procedural learning, and mathematical reasoning. It's not just language. Brain structure is impacted by socialization during that early childhood development, and social interaction remains critical in that learning process throughout our lives. Interestingly, informal and unrelated social interactions seem to provide value to learning experience as well. I stumbled on this and did not have a chance to dig into it very deeply, but if I were to guess or speculate, is the idea that as our brains are designed to learn in a social context, social interactions, even if they're not directly supported to the topic at hand, serve as primers, right? So when we're interacting with each other, our brains are being stimulated in a way that opens our minds to that learning process. So that process of being together in a room, interacting beyond seeing, hearing, includes things that are, there's touch, there's scent, we have olfactory senses, we have biochemical markers, we have pheromones, things interact. There are aspects to the experience of being a person in a social context that's not just hearing and seeing. And we have yet to invent technologies that replicate that. Verbalization and verbal interaction. Verbalization affects both the quality of features of learning and its efficacy. This isn't really news. We know this, right? Who has children? Who has ever asked their child to repeat after me? What did I just tell you? You're asking them to confirm that they heard you. You're asking them to confirm that they understood you, but you're also helping them commit that to their memory, right? But this goes in through all sorts of different techniques that we use all the time. Have you ever given a speech and you've practiced it ahead of time out loud? Yes, you may think you're doing it solely for the ability to speak and not hit those verbal tripping points, to avoid the verbal fillers, the ums. It's partially that, but when you speak it out loud, you're committing it into your memory in a way that you're internalizing it. So it helps with retention. It also helps with comprehension. And once you comprehend it, you then start to move away from having to verbatim remember what you're saying to understanding the concepts of what you're going to say and talk to the concepts instead of verbatim. Politicians do this very well. And while you'll very often see them just have bullet points because they just need a reminder of what concepts they want to hit, and those concepts are internalized. The other aspect of kind of the verbal interaction piece is that it serves as a tool to collect and organize and manage your thought processes, right? When you talk to someone, there's a process of encoding and decoding. And when you're trying to express something to someone, subconsciously, or if you're thoughtful, consciously, you're organizing what you're going to say to make that point, be it simple or complex. Your brain is working on, I need to communicate this. How do I manipulate it in a way to send it out so it has a chance of being understood? That is a process that helps your brain then understand, comprehend, process, and use that information. And as a receiver, on the other end, you're decoding it in the same way. You hear something, you process it, you decode it, you understand it. In that same way, it stimulates critical reflection, which enhances comprehension and performance. You see this with sports teams. There's been a lot of studies where teams that are very verbal in their interactions as they're playing are able to learn more and perform better in game, as well as moving forward, building skill in perpetuity as a team. That verbal interaction is more effective than any kind of written follow-up post-mortem work that they might do afterwards. In real time, that makes sense because it's happening in the moment, but the long-term impact of doing it in time carries over more than any kind of nonverbal interaction. And this is all rooted in the social constructivist approach in psychology. Kinesthetic learning, tactile learning. Tactile learners prefer to experience the world and act out events, so actually they're doers. And we all like to do things. Doing is learning, right? Extremely tactile learners get very little value from lectures or demonstrations. If they're not actively involved in doing it, it's not being processed, it's not being retained, they're not comprehending. But all of us benefit when we can actively do some of the work. An interesting dynamic is that much of The lecture process, kind of what I'm doing here, is not that, right? The standard approach is you stand in front of a room and you talk to them and you present information as passive listeners. You may try to interact with them, ask them questions, but still a listening and verbal interaction. There's value to that, but they're not necessarily actively doing something around the concept. So any way that you can start to pull in elements from that standpoint of getting in and physically doing something, touching, be that role playing, if it's a situational piece, or if it's a direct problem that they can get in and start working on, right? If you're talking about a specific tool or a process or what have you, have them doing it while you're talking. Even if it's as simple as if you're working on coding, have them doing some coding while you're talking. That helps internalize it. And we do that, right? That's an important piece of that. And this plays into the social aspect too, where if you're working on something in a tactile manner with other people, it just plays into that same supporting system of working together in a social context, accomplishes that internalization. Just building directly off from that, it's helpful if you talk about a subject, so you lecture around a topic, if you immediately follow up with applying that, right? The hearing something, learning something, memorizing something, retaining information uses a different functionality of your brain than applying that. You need to retain, comprehend, and then apply. And when you do that, it develops a deeper understanding of the overall information. And importantly, it switches the mode of thinking in a way that triggers a reset in your attention. And my next slide will talk about this a little bit more, but everyone has a limited attention span. There's a lot of studies around it, but consensus seems to be students have a 10 to 15 minute attention span before you need to do something to reset their attention. Whatever that is, you need to like get them to break their mode and enter a new mode, or else they just kind of fade and start to wander off, like you're losing them and they're not retaining it. So by switching them from listening to doing, it helps that reset. It switches their brain, they have their attention. And being able to go back and forth between different modes or different other techniques to do that reset helps to keep them focused. And again, it supports, effectively translates reading assignments and lectures into action in a facilitated setting, and part of the whole social learning experience. Last but not least, physical movement. Pretty straightforward pieces are, it improves concentration and retention. Have you ever been really focused on reading or working on a problem or what have you, and all of a sudden someone next to you, like, will you stop your leg from shaking? Will you stop tapping your pencil? You have a tendency to move when you're really focused. There's a tie there. It's a body's reaction to it. Movement relieves stress and tension. It relieves anxiety. We know that students or any person performs better when there's less stress and less anxiety. There's a reason that restricting movement is part of torture. Like that's a key component of human torture over the history of mankind. It is extremely uncomfortable. And unfortunately, environments, whether they be in a classroom like this or in front of a computer remotely, tend to be very passive. They kind of encourage that restricted movement, not literally tying them down, but you're not encouraged to move around and do things. And a lot of times movement can be distracting to others. So finding ways to involve them in physical movement that is meaningful is helpful too. You know, even if it's just taking a standing break, like I teach a class that's 2 hours and 50 minutes. Every so often, like, let's take a break, take 5 minutes, go get a drink, walk around. It gives them that reset. It gives them a physical break to let their bodies relax and move around. That is helpful. But even in the course of doing things, find a reason for them to move that's part of the work, right? Instead of having them work on assignment on the computer that they can do in, you know, Google Sheets or some whiteboarding application online, have them stand up, get them up at the whiteboard, have them sketching, right? That activity of getting them up and moving does that. It resets their attention, it introduces that physical aspect, it relieves some of that tension, and it kind of introduces a more positive feeling into the experience. And like I said, their average attention span is only 10 to 15 minutes per student. So the shed is quite different than most of our classrooms, and it's well suited to doing all of these things. This semester, I taught ISTE 500, Senior Dev Project 1, in shed 4350. It's on the 4th floor. If you take the elevator up, it's on your right. If you walk up the staircase, it's straight ahead. It is highlighted here in green and pointed at with a red arrow. So it is a large, big, open room. It seats 150 students at these mobile hexagon-shaped tables with mobile chairs. Everything in the room is easily movable. There are projections on all 4 walls. So if you're projecting like I am in this room, it's on all of the walls, and each wall is split into 2 segments. So it's kind of like 8 projection pieces. Like I said, whiteboards are on all the walls. There's also mobile whiteboards. So if you have people working in teams or different discussion groups, you can actually wheel a whiteboard right to their table and have them working on their own little whiteboard, or have them go to the wall. There's Zoom cameras on all 4 walls with controls to zoom and change the angles. There's a microphone and mic pack for the professor because it is a large room. And there's a few times this semester, it's new, where the mics didn't work. And I lectured for the entire time without it. Your voice gets very hoarse and mouth very dry trying to talk to a room of that size where they can all hear you. Although I will say it's very weird lecturing with a microphone like a game show host, but there's a mic pack. And then each table has like a little mic pot too that they can individually control for Zoom and for in room, where it will actually pick up the conversation. So if you're having conversations, they can turn their own mic pads on and off that has audio for the whole room, so they don't have to scream if you're having conversations. And there's no podium or lectern or anything like this. It's a big giant room. There is a little station where you can put your laptop to plug into to project. At the beginning semester, that was it. So there was a weird dynamic where if you wanted to change your slides, I would basically be walking around the room lecturing and then have to go to flip my slide. And even if I had the remote, you had to be close enough and angle enough to do it. You turn your back and have to do it. It was a little bit weird. I think someone gave them feedback that some kind of podium lectern thing would be helpful. So now there's a little wheelie, portable, very slim lectern podium that you can move around and use, which is somewhat helpful. So this is just a few photos from my class. So this was one of the teams doing a case study exercise in class. And this was one of the exercises we did where we talked about a number of things, but in this case, we had just finished discussing empathy maps, and I had them get up and do a little exercise for one of their key user groups. They did a little empathy map exercise, then we just had them discuss it and what they were thinking, and got feedback from everyone in the class and what they had done. All right. So a few things I tried to do in 500 to take advantage of this space and take advantage of some of these techniques I talked about. So for 500, we formed teams for the students that are based on a number of skills. So the historic way that we've handled it is a survey of 25-ish skills that they take at the beginning of the semester based on a 1 to 5 rating. They rate themselves. I have written instructions. I give them verbal instructions on how to think about rating themselves. They fill it out. After day 1, they get a couple days to fill it out. I take it. I spend half a weekend crunching data and trying to figure out who does what to mesh these skills to get balanced teams. I create the teams, and then they go in for 2 semesters work on a project. It tends to have very mixed results. Like if I did a little chart, I would say like, if you have 4 teams, you have 1 really good team, 2 okay teams, and 1 terrible team. Why? Well, no matter how much you talk to people, they don't really understand themselves. I don't think people in general are terribly self-aware or good at rating themselves. Students are certainly not. So people have a tendency to either overrate think they're better than they are, think they're worse than they are, or think they're absolutely average at everything. So if you don't have good data to work with, you have limited outcomes with what you have to work with. So that was a limiting factor. Now, with this room and having all of the students from 2 sections in one, the other part of this piece of why we did the surveying is we would mix between different sections, teams, again, to try to find the balance between everybody, independent of what section they were in. It led us to actually, we didn't have to take it offline, figure it out, switch students between sections and negotiate that whole process. We could just do it in there. So we did a live draft. We went through, and instead of going through rate yourselves, it was a much simpler process. Started out by asking, same skill sets, same kind of like skills, be like, who likes presenting? Who's good at presenting? All right, you go stand over there. Who is it, who has a strong database background? Who likes working with databases? You go over there, and kind of broke them up into skill sets based on their perceived skills and interests. The other part that was missing is kind of interest, right? Because you might be good at something and really hate it. That's something we didn't capture before too. So we did that, and then we basically had a negotiation. We started putting teams together, and then we'd have a verbal go around the room, try to assess like how balanced the team was. Then we put them into these kind of like pre-groups, had them discuss like, here's the type of project you're gonna be working on, these are skills you need, talk amongst yourselves, figure out if you have skills gaps. Gave them 10 minutes, came back, okay, do any teams feel that they have a missing set of skills? Some teams raised their hand, asked them what skills they were missing, and then it became a trading game. Like, okay, we don't have any front-end developers. Who has extra front-end developer skills? Cool, would you trade for that? And so it became like a little bit like draft day, trading up, trading down, moving things around. We juggled a bunch of people around, but in the end of the day, an hour and 15 minutes, we had the teams created instead of losing like 1 to 2 weeks of class, not class time, but to get the teams together and working usually takes a week or two. We had them on day one created. 9 teams. There's 65 students in that class. I had no idea how it was going to work out. It could have been a disaster. Having gone through the first semester of it, I think so far at least, observationally, it's worked out great. The teams seem much more balanced. We haven't had the same complaints on skills. We'll know after next semester if that's the case, but they seem better balanced. They also seem to be functioning better. I think that horse trading aspect of it, trying to work that out, got teams that functionally work better together because the human aspects were involved in it. We don't have teams that are functionally, there's always teams that don't work well together. That's just the fact of life in general, but also in that class, these teams all seem to actually at least work well together. And that curve of like 1 good team, 1 bad team, 2 good, 2 okay teams, it skews. I think there's a little bit more on the really good side, a lot more in that middle, and very few poor teams from my observations so far. It's not scientific. I don't have it in a spreadsheet and I haven't analyzed it. Observationally, it seems like it's going well. I actually did a class postmortem workshop with them last night where we basically ask, what worked, what didn't work, what would you like more in this class? They break apart into their teams. They write on those different colored sticky notes what worked from their perspective, what didn't work, what they'd like to see more. And then I have them come up with representatives from their teams one by one, put them on the board. We arrange them where there's redundancies or there's themes, we put them close together and get feedback, one of which was around how they felt about it. And it got really good feedback. So far that seemed like a hit. So far, so good. We also did some case studies. So we had a lecture as an example around ethics in business projects and on teams. And then I had a series of different case studies. Each team was given a case study in time in class where they'd review the case study. They had a few questions that they would work on answering those questions in class as a team. And then each team would go up and give a very brief synopsis of what the case study was and what their answers were to the questions. And there was a short debate by the entire class around each of it. They said they really enjoyed it. I think it just stimulated a lot of conversation around it. I think that worked fairly well. I tried what I called, I don't know if there's an actual term for this. I called it analogous skills exercises. But as an example, there's a piece of a lecture around giving presentations, right? And part of that's around techniques and best practices around communication skills. Again, encoding information, decoding information, understanding your audience, etc. But then at the end of the day, I'm like, if I want them to do something for part of this class time, I want them to be actively up and doing something. What can I have them do besides present something? What practical skill or thing can they do that would be better for presentations? And my mind went to what matters. What matters when you give a presentation? Being comfortable in front of a group, being out there and speaking, and being nimble, ability to adjust on the fly, get off script, and do something. So I did a little exercise where I went through and I created just little relatively innocuous topics on everyday objects or things, put them into a little baggie. And then I had the students come up one by one, draw a topic from the baggie and give a 1-minute monologue, pro or con, on whatever that topic is. It would be like toast or post-industrial complex, like any number of things, or military industrial complex, sorry. Anything, like a broad range of topics. So they give a little monologue on the spot around it. And then the group had 2 questions. The class could ask them 2 questions and they'd have to answer 2 questions about what their stance was on whatever this innocuous random topic was. And that was the idea, that being comfortable speaking in a large room in front of 65 other people about a topic you had no idea what you're going to talk about, and then answering questions about it with no pre-warning. And at first they were a little shy, like 1 or 2 brave students got up and started doing it. But by the end, there's like a line just waiting, because it's volunteer. I didn't force them. I was like, okay, this is volunteer. I'm not going to make every one of you do this, but let's try this out. And it started slow. And by the end, we ran out of time because everyone was jumping in line because they kind of got into it. And again, that got good feedback from the postmortem last night. And then we did an exercise around documentation, which we talked about from a technical standpoint. Why does it matter? What has to go into it? What does good documentation look like, etc. But again, in class, I mean, they had an exercise. I could have them work on their real documentation assignment. That was one option. But conceptually, I thought, well, one of the challenges with documentation, again, gets back to that encoding and decoding, right? Like taking something and from a concrete thing, turning into a concept in a document is hard. And then taking a concept from a document and turning it into a concrete thing is hard. So I went through and found a number of things in the world that are common enough they probably had seen them and had an idea what they were, but not everyday objects. So, and fairly complex things. So one was like a post hole digger. Another one was a tree stump grinder, like things that they probably have seen and had an idea. And I told the team that got the picture what it was. They could at least Google it. So every team got a picture and a description of what it was and what it did. Their job was to, in a certain timed exercise, write documentation that described physical structures of what it is and how to operate it. And from that document, they would switch with other teams and they would have to take that document and go up to the whiteboards and draw from the description of the machine what it looked like, and then try to guess at least what it did or what it was. Which honestly, I thought that might be a bust. I didn't know that was gonna be great. I was like, I'll try it out. You know, try things, sometimes they don't work. I didn't know afterwards how great it was. I would say that 75% of the teams figured out what it was. So I guess that was great. The feedback was pretty positive. I don't know if I'll reuse that one. I'm not sure it was great, but it was at least interesting. And again, I'm not afraid to try things. So outside of that, we just spent a lot of time. I built time at the end of the class, at least 15 minutes, usually a little bit more. If there wasn't some other exercise, that they generally have deliverables on a fairly regular basis, that they could work on the deliverables and I'd go around and help them. So as I work on giving them live feedback on what they're doing in class. There's a few times, and there's team presentations are core to the class. So there's a number of those throughout the semester. So that takes advantage of the space really well. And then a few times there were kind of these strange digressions. There were kind of ad hoc topical debates that would start very much on topic and kind of go off, but in a way that it translated a piece of what we were doing into like a socioeconomic debate that then brought it back to why this matters in the context of what we're doing. That happened once, and there was time, and I kind of let it go. I was like, let's see how this plays out. And so I let it go. I moderated it as a debate in class, essentially. And it's interesting. I don't know where I'm going there other than that format allowed that kind of debate. It was ad hoc. I hadn't planned it. If it could be planned, that might be an interesting technique as well. But that space is conducive to that too. Like being able to do that, because you can go around, you have control of microphones and sounds and things like that. It's really good for kind of topical debate sessions. So that's just a few things that I tried this semester. So at this point in the presentation, I will turn it over to the group. What do you guys think you could do with a space like this, that's different maybe than what you've historically done in our more traditional classroom spaces? And that's open to people online as well.
Yeah, I've thought about it a little bit in context of my classes where they're very, they're maybe more traditional classes where it's the lab, studio lab format, where it's sort of like we're doing programming, web development. That's where I've struggled a little bit to see how it, how we could do it. I say we could just bring in our laptops, but then that also leads into, new challenges. And then, for like our web and mobile one, that's such a big class, we also have requirements baked into the thing, that they should be using a Mac, so we have to have a specific Mac lab. So it sounds really cool, like working in that new space. It's just both, I don't want to say political, but kind of political, because you have to go back and change this course description, and then how do you teach those type of classes. I do recall CS maybe saying they were going to teach some of their intro to programming classes there, maybe. I remember hearing that. I don't remember. How do you think I guess you were asking us a question, how would I use this space, but I'm kind of turning it back and asking you a space. I'm trying to think of how I can use it.
Yeah, I mean, my take is like, if your class is absolutely dependent on using a computer screen, which a lot of the intro classes are going to functionally are going to be, that probably not the right space, right? Like, it's not really what its strength is. But if you can translate what you're doing, because there are things, one of the things I hate, I'll be completely honest, is that so much of what the students do, even in group work in here now, are because there's great tools for online collaboration where you can do a lot of the stuff that we always used to do on a whiteboard. They can just sit there on their laptops and do collaboratively together. They'll sit at a table not talking, doing the same little things, right? So I stop them from doing that. I make them do what we used to do on a whiteboard in class. That's a great tool if you're remote. That's a great tool for your homework when you're not sitting in the same room together. That's awesome. It's a great tool. Yes, please use that. When we're in class, let's get up, let's do it together, right? I think there's value in that. Maybe I'm just an old man yelling at clouds.
No, there isn't. And I made that mistake in my intro to Python course. We kind of gave them the option. They have this team part, they could work on the computer or the whiteboard. And I made a mistake of not just forcing them on the whiteboard day one. And they just divide and conquer the word. Basically, dividing and conquering, not working together.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, which is good for some problems, but not for what we're giving them.
Yeah.
And then they're stuck there. And then I walk by the other professor's course, and they're all up on the whiteboard. And it's the boat on this one. There's always next spring.
Yeah. Is there anything in that chat?
Not at the moment. I've let people know that I can ask on their behalf if they want, or they can unmute.
I mean, other thoughts are welcome too. It doesn't have to necessarily be the question posed at hand, but
there's another debate thing that you were talking about was interesting. It's like something that I'm creating a course for the spring, and I'm adding a component where I think it's going to be an assignment of this weighted that is debate related. But I'm not going to be in this space, which is unfortunate.
right. Well, I mean, it's not space dependent, right?
Yeah.
None of this is space dependent. Just so this is conducive to that. But
Yeah.
don't
So
let
I
that
guess,
limit your thinking.
No, so it's nice to hear that you found that worked very well with your students. And I think that Was it that one that you said that has less planning and it might work better with the planning, or was it around your optimized that you said?
That occurred accidentally
Okay.
and it worked out fine. I recognize that it could have gone terrible, right? It just happened to be fortuitous that in that specific instance, I think it added value to the class. It could have been a complete waste of time. It could have instilled bad feelings. I facilitated debates before, so I think I just rapidly went into that mode and controlled it in a way that it was okay. I think pre-planned, it would be an excellent tool. I think ad hoc, I managed the situation into an okay thing.
So what would be your like top tips then? And planning some kind of debate?
Planning a debate is interesting because you have to have a topic, but you need to allow them free range to explore it. And you need to define bumpers, especially if it's going to be anything that can veer off into really hot topics or things that might bump on policy concerns or we live in weird times. We live in contentious times. Let's go with contentious times. You never know what you're talking about, where it's going to go. And so be prepared to figure out where those bumpers are and avoid it getting anywhere near close to those, while also respecting giving the intellectual freedom. This is the balance we face, right? Like how do we promote intellectual freedom and how do we promote discussion and how do we promote that nonlinear lateral thinking, right? How do we get people thinking across these different ways and have these discussions without going off the rails and creating all sorts of chaos? It's a challenge. But that's why if you have a plan, you have a structure, you're aware where things could go awry and manage it, right? Just don't ever lose control of the conversation. So be gentle, don't, micromanage it, but you've got to be aware and you've got to be prepared to rein it in.
That's good advice. I also see that Becky has asked a question in the chat. Having an employer panel with students, how do you feel the shared set of thoughts?
Having
an employer panel for students. So I guess maybe bringing in employers to speak to the students.
Oh.
In that kind of space, so that's my interpretation anyway. You can, I mean, if I'm misinterpreting the question.
Did you say Betty?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm assuming it's maybe something Betty. Are you referring to like ISTE 99?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. It's certainly a lot of space, right? So there's value to that. You have the microphone, you have the presence. Like from that perspective, it's good. It may be, depending on what the employer expectation is, could be a little bit, it's not typical. So if you set expectations, it could be great of what to walk into. But I don't know if I were an employer panel coming in, like that's almost more like South by Southwest setup and less like a university setup system, right? So like set expectations ahead of time, that might be a good use of the space. Because I know people don't like to be surprised, right? You don't want how many of you have watched Pulp Fiction, right? Like, the opening scene where they're like, we should have shotguns for this. Like, why didn't you tell me you had a hand cannon? Like, people don't want to be surprised when they walk into these situations. Like, they want to be comfortable. But
I was just thinking the reconfiguration of the space is probably a great asset.
Mhm.
So I try to move students around, but in a room like this, the architecture kind of links that movement. You can't quite move tables and lab machines and stuff. So you become dependent upon that. So to be able to kind of move stuff around, reconfigure on the fly, even things like that will really a great asset.
I agree 100%. It's fantastic to just be like, okay, we're going to do this way, grab your tables and just like it's effortlessly, right? Like they're on wheels. There's no effort. You put them back, like slide your tables back where they were when you're done. It's not a big production. 30 seconds, boom, boom.
Did you give your plan in the did you ask specifically to have your plan?
So that's a good question and a good story. So the ISTE 500 that I teach in there is actually 2 sections of it with overflow for both, which even then is 65 or 66, something like that students, which for us, I understand is a lot of students, but is considered too small for the shed, which I disagree. I think actually that's a great number for that room. too many more, like you start losing some of that space that I like about moving around. But they say there's too few. But they didn't finish the shed until the day that like we started classes, and we needed the space. And the room they had us in, we were not up to fire code, and we originally wanted that space. And they were like, well, no one says it, you're in the shed. So, and now they've apparently grandfathered everyone that was in the shed before. So now, as far for the time being, because we were there, we're kind of grandfathered into the shed for a little while. So we're kind of there now, which is cool, as long as it doesn't get small. Like that room's supposed to be 150 people. So even by that standard, 65 is less than half capacity, which is why they push back.
So you can ask, and then you can ask
Yeah,
for
they,
your class to be scheduled there.
yeah, they weren't really happy about putting only 65 kids in there, but we lucked our way into that one.
I was just wondering, like, what do you say to them when you see they're sitting at their groups and just not talking to each other? Like, I need to get better at that. You just kind of yell at them, say, no, you should be, you know, or do you just say,
Well, I'm not shy, and I'm a bit of a smart aleck. So I come around and I'm like, oh, you guys are too loud. Can you quiet down? I'm like, what are you working on? Like, you know, I do it in a fun, I'm a pain in the butt in a fun way. Like I make them do things.
yeah, without killing kind of the joy of it, without, you know,
Yeah.
like screaming at them, but because sometimes you can, there's been a couple times where, yes, I've said it and it still doesn't change their mind. But at least some strategies that do help get them
Yeah.
motivated to do it.
I mean, yelling at them doesn't, like, you know, they're children. I mean, they're not children, but they're like children. We're all like children. You can't harass them into doing the right thing, right? So I do it in a good natured way. Like I said, I'm a bit of a smart aleck, so I'll come over and I'll make kind of smart alecky remarks about it. I'll ask them what they're working on. Hey, can you show that? I'll try to stimulate them into doing something, or I'll ask questions, you know, like, you know, it'd be great if you got to start on that. That's due on Tuesday. Maybe I can help you. Can I help you? Like, you know, I do everything but say, do it right now. Right. And sometimes, you know, the other policy I have for that class, outside of like presentations, things that depend on you have to be in class because that thing is graded like a presentation. You got to present to get a grade for that. I don't take attendance for that class. And my philosophy is you're an adult. If you don't show up, you don't get the value from it. Right. It's not a freshman class though. Like these are all last year, right? So if they haven't developed that skill by now, they're not going to develop that skill yet. Like when their employers fire them the first couple of times, then eventually they'll learn. But they actually usually, even the ones that start that way, eventually get there. Like they start to see the value, and the team members they have will either cudgel them into it, or they'll start to see the value of it. And they're like, well, actually, he helped us out while he was in class. If you had stayed, you would have. So, but I don't know that would work with freshmen or sophomores or what have you. Like there's a development of students from freshman to last year, I think.
So you mentioned that at least at the beginning, there was no podium, so I'm guessing, were you like walking around the class as you were?
Oh yeah, I was like Drew Carey on The Price is Right,
Yeah.
walking around with a microphone.
And do you think that actually changes the level of engagement or activity or number of questions that you're getting from the students?
I think so. Like I'm standing here because there's a camera there. If there weren't a camera there, I would not be doing this. I would wander over here when I start meandering off my little bullet points to recenter myself. But my natural tendency, sorry, camera people, I would be walking around the room like this. When I talk, I tend to do this. I don't like to just stand still in one place. It's one of the reasons I don't like teaching on Zoom and I don't like hybrid, because I feel physically constrained, right? I feel like I can't, this is my natural way of talking to a group. It makes me off my game when I can't walk around. Like I like to look at you, like I'm not like, but like I use my hands and I do things, and I find this limiting. Like it actually distracts me to be like, I must stand in the camera frame. I must stand in the camera frame. So it engages them more to answer your question, and it keeps me more engaged.
And to elaborate on my question, the reason I'm asking is the one thing that I miss about teaching on Zoom or online teaching was that students can ask questions privately. And I got a lot more questions that way because sometimes they feel dumb asking those questions. And now that we're back in person, I feel like those students that sit towards the front of the room are much more engaged compared to students that sit at the back. And I can imagine, like, if I feel like question might seem dumb, I don't want to shout that question, right? But maybe if the instruction is closer by, I feel a little bit more comfortable asking that. I wouldn't feel comfortable if you were sitting like that, but. What?
How do you feel?
Yeah, I feel very pressured right now, and I think that's how students might feel. right?
Okay, but this is a different situation, how working on a project. But in a project situation, you know, you're having a discussion problem, I can walk up and sit down.
Right.
And hopefully not in the threat. So, I don't know, I try to like, and again, it's weird too, because this is a presentation. And I'm talking at you, I haven't been talking with you the whole time, right? If I've been talking with you guys the whole time. Oops. If I've been talking with you the whole time, like I do in class, I wouldn't be walking around, I would have had a conversation with you. You would have said something, we would have been, it would have been a conversation, it wouldn't have been me talking at you. Right, so like, if you looked concerned, like I routinely, sometimes there'll be like students like you described in the back of the room. And they might, sometimes I'm legitimately worried there's something going on in their life by the look on their face, right? So, and again, the nature of like when we set up time for them to work on things as groups, there's kind of downtime where I don't have to, I'm not presenting, I'm not lecturing, kind of just milling around looking to help. I'll quietly go over and be like, hey, how's it going? You know, I'll check in on students and stuff. And so far, they seem to appreciate it. I don't know.
It's really curious because my experience in online teaching, it was I detected that the questions increased. I mean, it was loads of questions. It was people that were very shy before in the class in Zoom. Oh my God, there was an explosion of questions. I thought, I found a lot of activity.
Yeah, that's why I'm wondering if there's a way to bring that back out in person, if you have a more subtle way of gathering those questions.
Well, I mean, you could use like a Discord or Slack, right? Because a lot of the teamwork is like that.
They're talking about like in classroom. What I found is I do the, think fair share. When I do that, that usually gets them to go, A, I didn't understand what he said the last 10 minutes. B, I have something that I'm trying to work through, so I immediately have questions on that because I didn't understand what was supposed to really be doing. And then C, that brings up all the questions that I had about the last 10 minutes that I didn't actually think through and articulate and raise my hand and all those steps, but now I have had that opportunity. And also I know that if I don't say anything, like at this point, I've had a chance to think through it and talk with a partner. So as the instructor, I have no problem calling on anybody at that point. And if they are stuck, they will be like, well, I'm stuck. And so then, that helps a lot. I don't think it gets you the kind of loads of questions that you get, that you're getting from Zoom. I didn't have the same experience in Zoom, so I don't know.
Yeah, I'll say that my Zoom experience was different where, I mean, the people who I think probably in the room would have asked a lot of questions, asked a lot of Zoom questions. And the people in the room who seemed apathetic had their camera off and told me their cameras were broken. And I'm pretty sure they were playing Baldur's Gate 3 or something. Like they were not any more engaged and they had an easier time of disengaging. In fact, it gave them cover. I don't know. I'm just reflecting, like I had a different experience with it, I think. And to your question, the point of question is like, yeah, there's different people. Like in class, you have the extroverts that are going to be in the front asking the questions, not afraid to speak. And you're gonna have the quiet people. And Nancy will tell you this because I'm late all the time coming home. Like after class, the quiet ones line up, and then I spend a half hour afterwards answering questions, right? So, yeah, but yeah.
I'm just gonna reiterate or read out something that Steve shared on Zoom. So he likes these ideas and discussions, and he says that it seems like a natural extension to the reason that we first started with active learning. I think it's
Yeah, exactly.
I also had a very quick question, which I guess might be the last one, and then we should finish the time. I don't know if you mentioned this or not. You said you had about 65 students in the class. Do you know if they had any other classes this semester that was in one of those types of rooms? And if you got a sense of if there were, did they let you know of something that someone else was trying to do in one of the spaces?
Yeah, as far as I know, I don't know of any that did. They didn't share if they did. As far as I know, I'm the only one in iSchool and possibly Golisano that taught in there. One of the challenges being those rooms are huge and they're reluctant to book harder classes in there because we don't tend to have those 150 person classes. So I don't think so, but I can't swear that no one did. I don't have the feedback to give if there is.
So I think that if we do another round of applause, then, yeah, if anyone has any other questions, I guess.
You can always email me or stop by my office.